The amendment would now go to the Republican side.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Pitt.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk, well, the clerk will report the amendment.
Pitt 009.
And without objection, that amendment will be considered as read.
Reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment that I'm offering is co-sponsored by Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. We're offering a quite simple amendment. The amendment defines renewable as any form of energy that a state law deems as renewable or alternative.
That's okay.
29 states and the District of Columbia have renewable or alternative electricity standards. Many of the state standards include renewable or alternative forms of energy that are not included in the American Clean Energy Security Act. And I think we've circulated a list of the states with RES. The federal RES in the bill before us is in addition to, not in lieu of, any existing state renewable mandate. Thus, states must comply with their own state standards along with a federally mandated standard which may be difficult to meet. States understand their own geographic resources. The federal government should defer to individual states to decide what form of energy will best allow them to meet their renewable and alternative standard. Again, I've spoken to the Public Utility Commission in Pennsylvania, and this is a bipartisan group. They have sent a letter to us. I'll submit that letter for the record, if there's no objection.
Without objection, we'll receive the letter and put it in the record.
They've spoken out in a strongly bipartisan way, requesting this kind of amendment. Pennsylvania is a classic case. The state has approved a two-tiered alternative energy portfolio standard, 18%. Some of the forms of electricity that the governor and the state legislature have deemed as renewable cannot be found in the American Clean Energy Security Act. If a federal RES is passed into law, states should be able to receive federal credits for the source of energy they deem to be renewable or alternative. And with that, I'll yield to Mr. Murphy. He's not here. I'll reserve. He's not.
The gentleman yielded your time to Mr. Murphy, but he's not here at the moment, is he?
I'll yield back.
Oh, you yield back the time? Your time?
Chairman, I'll withdraw my point of order.
The gentleman withdraws her point of order. Chair recognizes Mr. Markey.
I thank the gentleman very much. This is an essential part of any law which we pass here today. We are trying to construct a national plan for the creation of a new generation of clean energy jobs. We are trying to create a new generation of technologies that will make it possible for us to back out imported oil from OPEC. We are creating a new plan that will make it possible for us to reduce dramatically the greenhouse gases that are sent up into the atmosphere that are dangerously warming our planet. We are trying to put together a national plan to improve the public health of the citizens in our country. We are writing a federal national law. That is our job. And this provision, the provision that deals with renewable electricity generation, has been carefully negotiated amongst all of the members who have a desire to work to put together a new formula for our country. Unfortunately, there are many states in the Union that have no renewable electricity standards at all. There are others that have standards that are all across the map. What we're trying to do here is to put together a national plan, a plan that we need for our own national security, for job creation, and to deal with this serious issue of climate change. It's not a standard that is one that is beyond the reach of any one of the states. That's why we made our definition so inclusive. That's why the definition of wind and solar and biomass and geothermal and waste are so broad, so that it is possible for every state to meet the standard, so that we can put in place a plan to protect our country. So I can't think of something that would go right to the heart of this in terms of the plan that we've put together.
Against the bill, too.
We're sending a signal to new energy developers all across the country.
You know.
We're sending a signal to investors all across the country, and by the way, all across the world, to look to the United States to invest in this new generation of renewable energy technologies. They need the certainty. They need the predictability of knowing what this national marketplace is going to look like. And the amendment by the gentleman from Pennsylvania will just cut the legs out from under it. It will allow for, once again, this a cacophony of different standards or no standards to exist. Yes, we want individual states to have their own standards. And yes, we want them to be even higher, and in many states they will be higher than the standard that we have in this law. But we cannot allow for this to continue in a way that does not signal to the investing community, to the entrepreneurial community, to the technological community, that there is not a consistent long-term plan in place for people to invest in. Now, I know Mr. McNerney down here is an expert on these issues, and would you like to speak to that issue, Mr. McNerney, the issue of the need to create this national predictable marketplace for renewable electricity?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I spent 20 years or more developing wind energy technology, and what happens in the market is that if the government support or government subsidies are insecure or fluctuate, then those markets go away. Investors need to know what the market's going to look like to be able to put their money into technology. When that doesn't happen, the technology will go overseas. Technology that we developed in this country will go overseas and be built and be manufactured and be sold, and profits will go overseas in those jobs with them. So we need a consistent, well understood and predictable government position on these issues and support. And if we don't have it, I'm afraid we're going to be losing jobs rather than gaining them. So I think the chairman and
I thank the gentleman.
Yield back.
The gentleman knows this field well. If we want the investment in these new technologies, if we want to be exporting these new technologies overseas rather than importing them from other countries that are going to go too far ahead of us, then vote no on the Pitts amendment.
We've had 5 minutes of debate on each side. Are we ready for the question, Mr.
2 minutes.
I'd recognize the gentleman for 3 minutes, and I hope he'll yield some time to Mr. Murphy.
I'll do that. We're going to give some of these allowances to the states to distribute as they see fit. We're going to give the authority to the state PUCs to regulate and make sure that the local distribution companies in each state pass through the rebates, but we're not willing to give the states the authority to have a different definition of what's renewable. What this tells me is that this carefully crafted compromise we keep hearing about is a compromise in political correctness where only the people on the majority side in the Energy and Commerce Committee know what's right for the entire American economy. Well, there's some really, really bright folks on the majority side in this committee, and almost every one of them, well, in fact, every one of them that I know is I consider to be a good friend and a very capable legislator. Some of the newer members I don't know very well, but I'm sure they're just as qualified. But as bright and as capable and as sincere as the majority is, not all knowledge in the country is on the right side of this committee dais. And what Mr. Pitts is saying is if a state has a renewable portfolio standard in existence, let it be the standard in that state for this section of the bill. If a state doesn't, then the definitions in the bill are the definitions for those particular states that don't have it. That's all it does. It's taking the logic and the policy that the majority has put together, but it's simply saying, let's take advantage of differences by state and use, if they have a renewable electricity standard, let's let that definition apply. I think that's common sense.
Gentlemen,
I would hope we accept it. I'd be happy to yield to this.
I just want to point out that what we did in this renewable portfolio provision is to have a standard for the whole country, but to recognize the regional differences. And we did that in the proposal that we had before us. And I think if we would change that along the lines of this amendment, it would do harm to what we're trying to accomplish, which is to produce more renewable fuels. So we let the governor of a state certify that the state can't meet the renewable requirement of 15%. And that way the state can play a role. We let the states go higher than the national standard, but we have a national standard, and we think it's important to have it.
Well, reclaiming what little time I have,
I'll yield.
Washington doesn't always know best, even on the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I'm going to yield a little bit.
The gentleman's right, and Texas and California don't always know best either.
Mr. Murphy, for my last 6 seconds.
No, I'm going to yield to Mr. Murphy. How much time would you like, Mr. Murphy? 2 minutes. Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Let me add to this. I know that we need base load of energy. It's not, the wind is great, solar is great, but as they say, when the wind don't blow, the lights don't glow, and when the sun ain't bright, the bulbs don't light. What we have to have is a base load. And I know in our state, our good Governor Rendell, former head of the DNC, was wise enough to say we could use waste coal as part of this. There's 250,000 acres of abandoned mine lands and 2,200 miles of streams impaired by polluted mine drainage, which puts aluminum and manganese and iron into our streams and makes them lifeless. And what the state legislature did in Pennsylvania, working with the governor's office, they said, let's use waste coal. It actually emits less, has less emissions than regular coal-fired power plants, and I'd like to see us do that. Now, I know this bill does allow municipal waste, and that's good. But let's understand that coal is also has its waste from these huge gob piles that are like mountains in areas. And this is why we'd like to see as part of this to allow the states to include as part of what they have done in their wisdom, and waste coal being among them. I think that would help immensely. Whether that's already in the bill, Mr. Chairman, that would allow our Governor Rendell to ask for a waiver to include waste coal, perhaps we can clarify that, but I believe this amendment would give us some latitude to allow that to happen anyway, so that states have already made some actions towards cleaning up our environment with these kind of things can go into place. But I yield back the rest of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. We'll now proceed to a vote. I'd like to see if we could take this on a voice vote. We'll ask for the yeas and nays by
Chairman,
voice.
I'd like a recorded vote, please.
Okay. We'll go to a recorded vote. Clerk will call the roll.
California standard.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingell. No. Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. No. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette.
No.
Mr. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps.
No, sorry.
That's right. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle.
No.
Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon.
No.
Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky.
Hey, Pat,
Ms. Schakowsky votes no.
what title of the bill was?
Mr. Gonzalez. No. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. No. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross?
Wait, okay. Yeah, combined efficiency and
Mr. Weiner?
standard.
Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson?
Here's
Mr. Butterfield?
So we allow.
Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill? Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Ms. Sutton? Mr. Braley? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bonomack? Ms. Bonomack votes aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Space? Mr. Space votes aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall votes aye.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? And the clerk will tally the vote. Clerk, ready to announce the vote?
Yes, sir. On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 23, the nays were 31.
Well, it is a different vote than the last one.
23 to
23 ayes, 31 nays. The amendment's not agreed to.